I was
Good.
wondering, are they going to try again? But thankfully, they
No,
did
thank you.
succeed. Yes. So, yeah, no, thank you so much, Dr. Pappe, for joining me today and for your patience and understanding regarding last Tuesday. So, just before we get started in earnest, I was just wondering if you could just provide us a self-introduction.
Okay, my name is Ilan Pappe. I was born in Israel, in Haifa, in 1954. I had conventional Israeli Jewish youth and education, which continued through my years as a young adult in the Israeli army, and then which is compulsory in Israel. And then I went to the university in Jerusalem, started an academic career as a historian. And ever since then, I started a new journey, a journey into the past that really changed my views about the present and my vision for the future. And I I did a doctoral dissertation at the University of Oxford in the early 1980s. Sorry, I came back to Israel and taught as a member of faculty in several universities, especially in my hometown university, University of Haifa. And since the beginning of this century, I found myself in a constant clash with mainstream academia, mainstream media, with the state in many ways, that eventually forced me to leave the Israeli academia. And since 2007, I'm at the University of Exeter in Devon, United Kingdom in Britain. And I'm the director there of the Center for Palestine, European Center for Palestine Studies. And I wrote several books on the history of Palestine, the Middle East, our knowledge. And I think that's my
Yeah,
introduction.
that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
So, growing up in Israel, presumably you had a different education about the story of Israel or the history of Israel than the one now that you're sharing with the world. When did it first occur to you that the full story was not maybe being told?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was a journey. I don't think it was one particular moment, one epiphany, if you will.
Right.
It gradually happened. I think it first started by my decision as a young professional historian to work on, first of all, the history of my own country, and secondly, to choose the most formative year of that history, which is 1948, and decided that I needed to wait for declassification of documents to test the history that I was familiar with. And I think so, one can say that the first stop in this journey, or this first station in this journey, was the archive. The archive was very important. The documents for me were very clear as evidence that many of the things that I was taught about were not true, were fabrications, were distortion of truth. The second stop was leaving Israel for my postgraduate studies, which enabled me to meet Palestinians on equal footing, which is very difficult to do in Israel. And through this intimacy, I was able to see that actually their perception of the past, their narrative, can easily be corroborated with what I found in the archive. And that strengthened this idea that I have two options, either to continue, because I knew I would be a teacher of history, a professor of history, and so on. So it was not just a matter of what do you do in your free time. It was a matter of how you're going to go back to Israel and teach courses, which are actually on the history of Israel. That was what I was meant to do. I already had an offer from several Israeli universities to be a professor of history. So the question is, how do I teach it? And this meeting with Palestinians, reading Palestinian works, meeting influential figures such as Edward Said, who became a very good friend, um, and having an Arab, not a Palestinian, but an Arab supervisor in Oxford who was very close to the Palestinian issue, Albert Hourani. I think, and together with the archival material, convinced me that I was actually the only choice I had was to try and see whether I could teach my own truths about what happened. And at first, this was even welcomed in a certain way in the 1990s when I started teaching in Israel, in the late 1980s and 1990s. But we'll talk about it, I suppose. In the beginning of the 21st century, the whole atmosphere changed, and challenging the narrative as a professional historian became an act of treason. And that's where my travels really started.
Yes. Oh, wow. So it sounds like you did have that support there in England before you returned. Academic,
Oh, yes, like
collegial.
I mentioned,
Yes.
I had another supervisor, also both of them unfortunately are not with us, Roger Owen. I had two supervisors. Roger was a British professor, not an Arab like Albert Hourani, but he was very much on the left and very familiar with the realities in Palestine. And so I had kind of two very knowledgeable, perceptive mentors and supervisors who helped me to see that. And Edward Said later was the third one. So I really owe them a lot. I mean, I did the whole job by myself, but it was hearing them and listening to them. You could not brush it aside as a lie, as propaganda, and so on. I think that's what I mean by their importance.
Right.
You meet people who impress you on everything that they do, and they tell you, the way that you describe things is wrong. It's not, and you know that you're a product of a certain indoctrination and education as a young person. You're very impressionable. And it takes time to get liberated. But once you're liberated,
yes.
I mean,
Yes. And so that led you into your big area of work, or one of your big areas of work, if I can call it that, namely uh, studying the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, I know that people, of course, who are familiar with your work know what that means, but for those who might be new to your work, could you just sort of elaborate on what that term means?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Definitely, Paul. It was a matter of, it was something new for me when I said to myself that I don't want just to describe what happened in 1948, because by the time I wrote the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, I already had written two books on 48. There was not, and I was not the only one, and I was not the only one who was using new archival material. There were others, Israelis and non-Israelis, Palestinians, and so on. So it was not a matter of writing another book that tells you what happened, because people knew what happened, especially Palestinians knew what happened because they were victims of what happened. But even people who experience it, as we know, witnesses do not see the whole picture when it happens to them. This is the importance of the work of the historian. They have the ability to see things in a more general way. And I always felt there was something missing, even in the Palestinian narrative, that this huge event by which half of a country's population is being removed within less than a year. Hundreds and hundreds, more than 500, which are half of its villages, are wiped out. Most of our towns, most of its towns are demolished. And you can't find almost any acknowledgement of that in the Western world. And it happened within the Western world. Yes, it happened in Palestine, but Palestine was part of the Western world. It was under the British mandate. It was closely associated in the minds of so many people in the West with the Jewish problem, with the Holocaust, with anti-Semitism. So you would have expected, that this is not a minor event. It's not a minor event when you destroy a whole country, and the people who destroyed the whole country are the victims of the genocide, or at least they speak in the names of the victims of the genocide of Europe. And I didn't know exactly how to frame it. And then I started reading about similar cases in history where suddenly huge populations are being removed, are being displaced, and being replaced by another
Right.
population. Usually one ethnic group replaced by another ethnic group. We were fortunate, is not the right word, but because, I won't use this word, but because of what happened in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, in the former Yugoslavia, scholars and activists understood that what they were watching in former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, massive displacement of people because of who they are, not because of something they did, because of their identity. That this is actually a recurrent historical phenomenon. That this is not new, and unfortunately, probably will not be the last time that we will be watching. And Myanmar came later, and we've seen ethnic cleansing happening until recently. So I studied the definitions, and I decided to look at the definitions of more kind of friendly, if you want, locations for Israel. The State Department, the American State Department, scholars who write on ethnic cleansing but are not known to be particularly critical on Israel. And they all had very clear legal, moral, and scholarly definition of this idea, of this situation by which one group displaces another group in a certain area, motivated by a certain ideology that justifies this expulsion, that does not allow people to return after they were expelled, and does not, and also sanction the massacre of people if needed, in order to implement the massive expulsion. And the term that kept coming back from international tribunals, from the International Court of Justice in The Hague, from inquiry commissions, from scholarship, was ethnic cleansing. And because I already knew the facts of what happened and how it happened, I was surprised that nobody before me ever thought of explaining what happened in 1948 as an ethnic cleansing, which have huge moral implication. It means it's a crime. First of all, ethnic cleansing is a crime. Nothing justifies ethnic cleansing. So it's regarded as a crime against humanity. And it's surprising, of course, that even in the popular encyclopedias and the more established encyclopedias of university publication, which have a very long entry under the term ethnic cleansing, Palestine is not mentioned until today.
Yes.
And this really baffled me. And so I decided to see what happens if I start the story from there. And if it's a crime, you're looking for criminals. You're not only telling the story of the victims, which everybody else did. They told the story of the victims.
Right.
I did nothing new to tell about what the Palestinians went through, but I had something new to tell about the nature of what they experienced. In fact, my publishers were very much against the term, the title. I had a long argument with them. They thought it would deter readers.
Yes.
But I told them this is what the book is about. This is what the book, and this is what, if the book succeeds, it will change the discourse on how we treat 48. And I'm glad to say that in many ways it contributes to a change in the discourse on 1948.
Certainly. When you talk about, Dr. Pappe, the idea of Israel, is that different from the state of Israel more generally, in terms of historically what it's been or the current state of affairs? Or what does that phrase mean when you employ it?
Yes. This phrase is very important, first of all, for someone like myself. I'm a citizen of a state. I'm paraphrasing a famous sentence from Leonard Cohen's, one of his songs that he hates. He loves the country, but he hates the state. He says he hated the scene, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
a very complex
Right,
relationship between a country and a state. It's not the same. Of course, nationalism, fascism insist that a country and a state must be the same. That
right,
you cannot belong to a country if you do not totally you're not totally behind your state. This is the whole Republican
right.
slogans in the recent two presidential campaigns in
Yes.
America. It wasn't always the case with the Republican Party, but
Mm,
recently was,
yeah.
unfortunately. So I'm starting there, that there is a country which is very tangible, very real. It is the rivers, the mountains, the smells, the food, the habitation, the people who live there. Yes.
Right.
But there is a state which is an artificial to man. It's an artificial political structure that, if it does not reflect the country or the people living in the country, there is a cognitive dissonance. There's a
Mm,
problem.
yes.
And I think Israel is such a state. It has a problem. The state does not reflect the country. There's a simple example. Israel is a binational country. It's a binational country. There's an equal number of Palestinians and equal
Right.
number of Jews. But Israel says no. It's the nation state of the Jews. It cannot be the nation state of the Jews because it's a valid point. It can be the nation state of the Jews if it imposes its will by force on the
Yes.
reality of the country. Now, force is not enough. That's why I came up with this idea of Israel, also in the title of my book, that you need to commodify, you need to sell the idea that actually what you see with your own eyes is not the reality, but actually there is a virtual reality, which is the one you have to subscribe. So if I go to an
Right.
American Jewish community and I want them to support Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, and God forbid if someone asks me, how can you be the only democracy in the Middle East if you have been occupying half of your citizens for more than 52 years? How does it tally with the idea of democracy? You're
Right.
working very hard to say to them, this does not defy or this does not undermine my insistence that I am a democracy. Or
Yes.
if you say, we created the Jewish state, and you say, yes, but there's so many non-Jews in the Jewish state. And you need an idea which says, no, no, this is a Jewish state. So it means the non-Jews are not really part of the state.
Right.
Now, I came with this notion because I understood that A, you had to sell this idea of what Israel is, which is not, doesn't tell you with the reality on the ground. You had to sell it, first of all, to the Israelis themselves, you
Right.
know, and then you had to sell it to the West, because without Western support, Israel could not exist, especially to the United States of America. And then also you wanted to sell it to very good, conscientious people, moral people, because you wanted moral justification for what you did. So the idea of Israel is a kind of a laundrette of words, for instance, that would say that you can't say ethnic cleansing. It was not ethnic cleansing. It was
Right.
a voluntary flight by the
Yes.
Palestinians. You cannot call it occupation. It's redemption, you know, and so on and so on. You cannot call it self-defense. In the case of the Palestinians, it's terrorism.
Ah.
Um, and I claim that two particular sections of the society were needed to sell this idea successfully. And it was a
Yes.
success until recently. As I say in this book, The Idea of Israel, eventually there are problems with this campaign. It doesn't work anymore too
Right.
well, probably since 2000, 2010.
Mhm.
But it worked for a while. And I claim that on the one hand, the movie industry,
Yes.
including people in Hollywood, were very important in selling a fictional picture of the reality that would fit the idea that Israel is a Jewish democratic state with no discrimination against anyone, without occupation, without ethnic cleansing, without systematic violation of other people's human and civil rights. You needed the movies because the movies talk to the imagination of people and so on, and they're very persuasive, as you know.
Right.
And
Yes.
you needed the academia. The academia gave you the impression that the fictional reality, the fictional picture of the reality produced is actually sustained by facts. So you can write a whole article on the fact that Palestine was empty before the Jews came, which is a lie.
Hmm.
But it was not empty. But
Yeah.
but if you have a scholarly article that claims it and
Right.
has 55 footnotes or endnotes, it looks very
Yes.
impressive. It looks as if,
Yeah.
there was and unfortunately for a while, not anymore, thank God, mainstream academia in the West went along with it. They didn't even question the validity of these scholarly work, and the film industry was very happy to show the Arabs as the villains and the Jews as the epitomizing of just warriors of the West civilization and progress. This kind of counter. It's all slowly changing, by the way. But
Yes.
for a while, I think it was not the only reason that Israel succeeded in doing what it did, but it was an important part of protecting what it did.
Oh, certainly. And I've read your work also on what you call the branding or the rebranding of Israel in the 2000s. Now, was that happening at that time because there was a sense by the state that we're losing control of the narrative? I mean, social media was not what it is now. It was beginning to emerge. But is that one of the reasons that we have to kind of send in reinforcements?
Absolutely. The moment there is democratization of information, of passing information, disseminating information, we know it can go in any possible direction, this democratization. It
Right,
also gives stage for lunatic ideas, extreme
right.
ideas, and so on. But there's one thing about that. It's not as easy to control it as it is when it comes to mainstream media.
Yes.
Editorials of the main newspapers in the United States or the TV stations in the United States. And the Israeli lobby was very good in
Hmm.
making sure that the main newspapers in America and the main TV stations in America would never divert from the basic Zionist narrative. They were allowed to adopt liberal Zionist ideas and condemn here and there Israeli actions, but they were not allowed to question the whole idea of Zionism or the whole idea of
Yes.
Israel, as we called it. And yes, the internet and especially the alternative media
Hmm.
allowed civil society access to information that was not there in the mainstream media. So suddenly people were aware, and as you know, the more the internet grew, the information was not just verbal; it was also
Yes.
visual. It was also audio, and this coupled with actual visits on the ground of young members of the civil society made it impossible to sell the Israeli version of events as valid,
Yes.
morally, and so on. And so the Israeli government decided to create a whole ministry, the
Hmm.
Ministry of Strategic Affairs, to fight against what they saw as a growing delegitimization of the Jewish state because they were losing the moral ground.
Yes.
And that's how they decided to call it. I don't think it was necessarily delegitimization of the state of Israel. It was just talking about the reality on the ground and asking Israel tough questions. Why
Right.
are you such a rogue state that systematically abuses the Palestinians? I mean, that was the question they were asked. Now, nobody sort of put them on the pedestal and then told them that they are, a bunch of criminals. Um, this didn't work. The brand Israel, it actually
Right.
was called BIG. It was called
Oh,
BIG,
right. Yes.
Brand Israel Group, which in America meant recruiting the best PR people, Sachi, Israeli actresses like Gal Gadot. She was only the beginning
Hmm.
of her career. Any professor, any publicist, any pundit, literati that they could recruit in order to sell Israel as a very positive, groovy place.
Right.
This is the time of the pink washing.
Yes.
Israel becomes a haven for gay culture. And nobody mentions the 10 kilometers from the gay center of Tel Aviv is the ghetto of
Mm,
Gaza.
mm.
But this was, they thought it would work, but it didn't work. So we are now at a different stage of trying to fight against against this erosion of Israel's moral international image. And this stage now is characterized by weaponizing anti-Semitism in order to silence any criticism of Israel.
Yes.
Namely, you're not allowed even to argue about the fact. If you argue about the fact, you're anti-Semite or a
Yes.
self-hating Jew in my case. So I think that's where we are today. You cannot use F-16 against people who think that you are in an apartheid state. But you can try and get them out of their jobs, make make their work illegal if you can in some states in the United States and so on. So this is the
Right.
battlefield now in many ways.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about whether there's a connection, a very strong or tangential connection there with Zionism as a worldview. So, having been trained in philosophy, not a
Mhm.
historian like yourself, you know, we're always questioning our assumptions, our own ideas, to the point sometimes where it's just
Mhm.
it's paralyzing. So I wanted to make sure to ask you, so Zionism, is that the official um what did we say, worldview, that philosophy that is embraced by the state of Israel today?
Yeah, well, I think I'm glad you're asking me
Yes.
that because, it's one of the things that, one of the major allegations nowadays Israel is making against its critics,
Yes.
uh, succeeded in recruiting few governments in the West to accept this, is to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And you cannot defend yourself well against this allegation unless you define, first of all, what Zionism is.
Right. Exactly.
And like so many isms, you, even if you reach it from a philosophical perspective, you have to recognize that there is an historical process. The definitions are not static, that they begin as something and then they transform into something else. They may carry with them the basic features of the idea when it was conceived in the first place, but they change according to the way people encounter reality,
Yes.
using that ideology as a tool to interpret reality. So it's very interesting to know that actually Zionism, first of all, there is a term, Zionism, that is not at all connected to what we are talking about. You
Okay.
know, Zionism is a stream of music in the Caribbean.
Oh, right, right. Yeah.
Zionism
Like,
was Zionism was a certain way of understanding Christianity by Africans in South Africa. Zionism at the time of Matthew Arnold and the Victorians was the antidote to Hellenism. It was used as a term to fight hedonism and promiscuity, and to say actually Zionism meant
right.
living a more pure life. We're talking about political Zionism, which actually began as a Christian evangelical project
Yes.
before it became a Jewish one.
Hmm.
Evangelical Christian project of Zionism began somewhere there in the early 17th century already. And this was an anti-Semitic idea, or rather more precisely, an anti-Jewish idea. The idea was that since it's impossible to convince the Jews to convert to Christianity, and it's not possible to tolerate the way of life within Christian societies, they should be encouraged to go to Palestine,
Yes.
because their return to Palestine, as these evangelical Zionists saw it, evangelical Christians saw it, their return to Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of time. And in that
Right.
end of time scenario, anyway, they will convert to Christianity or would be shish kebab in hell. This is the beginning of an idea that had a lot of influence of Jewish thinkers
Right.
in the early 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe who were worried about the rise of new kind of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism that emerged in Europe was very disappointing from every respect because it came at a time when actually Jews wanted to assimilate. When Jews said, yes, we don't want to be unique, we want to be part of your society, we're not different. And
Right.
the reaction was, unfortunately, in this also the Catholic Church played a role, and of course, fascist ideologies. It turned against this idea of the assimilation of the Jews. And some Jewish thinkers, rightly now, we understand in hindsight, felt that it would not end there, that there is an existential danger for Jews in Europe with this new kind of anti-Semitism that began to emerge in the mid-19th century and so on. So the question is, what do we do against it? And
Right.
this Christian Zionist ideology gave the idea that maybe, even if the source for it is anti-Semitic, maybe it is the good idea, not only because you run away from a dangerous Europe, but because you may find your national roots again. You may
Mhm.
redeem an ancient homeland. You will become a normal nation among the nations. You cannot become a normal citizen among
Mhm.
the citizens of Europe, but maybe you can become a normal nation in the community of nations. Now, this by itself was not, this was a noble idea. This was a very relevant thing. The problem was that once they chose Palestine as the location for this transformation from being European Jews to being a race by themselves, as they called it. I would never call it a race, but they called
Mhm.
themselves a race by itself or a nation by itself. The moment they decided that this transformation can only occur on the biblical land of Palestine, they became a settler colonial movement, not a national movement. So the only way to save yourself from Europe was to dispossess Palestine from the Palestinians. So Zionism goes through all these processes. Now, what is Zionism today?
Yes.
Zionism today, and that's what you were asking, but I think
Yeah.
we need this background. You know, you can't
Right.
start from it today. Zionism today is an ideology. It's a state ideology. First of all, it's a state ideology,
Yes.
and this ideology affirms as morally valid, as scientifically valid, the idea that the whole of Palestine belongs to the Jewish people and only to the Jewish people, and that the rest of the Jews who do not live in Palestine or in Israel are most welcome and should actually come to Israel if they want to be safe, to be
Right.
safe. And anybody who's not a Jew and anybody who lives on the land who is not a Jew can be tolerated to a certain degree if they are willing to give up any collective rights, any demands for the land, or if they're willing to build a small Bantustan on
Mhm.
5 to 6% of the land, that's okay. But they cannot question the exclusivity of
Yes.
the Jewishness of the country. From that, everything else emanates. Discriminatory laws, apartheid regime, ethnic cleansing, and of course, very severe, brutal reaction to any Palestinian who dares to question this ideological interpretation of the reality.
Oh, absolutely. And it all makes sense here how you're explaining it because I I feel, it's a strange thing to be calling yourself a liberal democracy, when that's also happening. So, would it be fair? Because I know this is contentious as well, but, and as you know, of course, in the 70s, there was a resolution about this in the UN. Zionism, is it fair to say that it is racism?
Mhm.
Is it racist, or because I feel like, it's such a charged term, like, or is it, it sounds like it would be according to what you're saying. I mean, I can't think of denying people rights on the basis of their ethnicity and so forth. Yeah, and that not being a kind of racism if it is grounded in Zionism.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you're right, Paul. It's interesting the way it comes to branding a Jewish ideological movement, or ideological movement which is nowadays subscribed to by many Jews, not all the Jews in the world, but certainly.
Right.
By the way, it's also subscribed by quite a lot of Christians who are
Yes.
Christian
Yes.
Zionists. Um, it's somehow difficult to accept, especially I think because of the Holocaust and the centuries of anti-Semitism, that victims of racism can be racist themselves. I think there is this kind of one kind of hurdle you have to remove is to expect that abused people can be abusers, victims
Yes.
can be victimized. It's not the only case in history that this happened. It happens in individual life as well, as we know. You know, abused children can be
Yes.
abused parents. This is nothing spectacular about it. This happens. Now, settler colonialism, I think the most accurate definition for Zionism until the creation of the State of Israel is settler colonialism. To
Yes.
define Zionism and settler colonialism is academically valid. It's not a political opinion. I think that anyone who does a proper academic research would reach that conclusion. And to define Israel as a settler colonial state that still engages in active settler colonialism, I think is also a very fair description of the reality. Now, at the heart of settler colonialism is a certain attitude towards the native, the indigenous population. That's the whole essence of settler colonialism. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it settler colonialism. The issue is that you choose a place where someone else lives.
Hmm.
And that someone else is the main, in your eyes, the main obstacle for your success, for your existence, maybe, for your continued presence, because you actually invaded someone else's homeland, actually. And in order to decide what to do with these people, whether these are the Native Americans, the First Nations, the Aboriginals, the Maoris, or the Indian tribes of Latin America, South America, in
Yes.
order to decide what to do with them, you have to dehumanize the people. Otherwise, you cannot think massively of massively killing them, expelling them, removing them. They cannot, Paul Gilroy, I think, calls it infrahumanity. You have to kind of think of them as lesser human beings, ones
Yes.
who don't really have the same aspiration as you do, don't have your same cultural level as you do. And, you know, the Zionist thinkers and politicians were verbose. They didn't stop writing. They didn't stop talking. You're very fortunate as a historian of Zionism. There's so much material to read. And this kind of attitude that I'm describing here
Right.
towards Palestinians is there from the first encounter in the 1880s until this morning. It's
Yes.
there all the time, dehumanizing the Palestinians, seeing them as an obstacle, seeing them as aliens, which is really bizarre. The aliens who are the settlers see themselves as indigenous and regard the indigenous people as aliens. And
Yes.
or looking at it differently in order to justify the term racism in this case, Palestinians are treated the way they are treated, not because of what they do, but because of who they are.
Yes.
I think is the essence of racialization of someone. And I think one of the problems of having a proper debate in America about Zionism is that you're not allowed to make this equation. And without this equation, you don't begin to understand why there is such a moral indignation among a lot of people towards the state of Israel and towards the ideology that
Yes.
informs the state of Israel. Because people in America have experienced racism. They still do experience racism.
Yes.
So
Yes.
some of them, you know, You talk to Black Lives Matter. These people understand exactly the connection between racism towards African Americans and racism towards Palestinians. I think it's important to go back to that resolution that you've mentioned,
Yeah.
only in one respect. The United Nations in 1947, is the international body that legitimized the establishment of a Jewish state.
Yes.
This was the, famous resolution 181, suggested that Palestine would have two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And that was a vindication of Zionist efforts to ask the international community to legitimize the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. The international community represented through the United Nations General Assembly in 1947 did not include, apart from one member state, did not include anyone from the colonized world. From the world that was still under colonization and suffering from racism. In 1975, the General Assembly included the decolonized world.
Okay.
And from them, this was not anti-Semitic, this was not anti-Jewish. They just came out of more than a century and a half of Europe, especially in Africa, of century and a half of being treated in the most appalling racist way by European colonialist power, and especially also the United States. And they just came out of it. And they look at, if you remember, this is the time when they also passed similar resolutions against apartheid South Africa. So they look around them and they see two states that are welcomed by the West, the colonialist West,
Yes.
as dignified members of the civilized world, who are practicing racism in an institutional and legal way against the native people of their state. So I think, yes, one can understand where this resolution came from. One can understand why it is important to tackle racism in Israel, racism that is institutional, that is ideological, that is part of the educational system, part of the discourse of the media. I think it's very important. I think also for the Israeli Jews themselves.
Yes.
It's not easy to convince them that, they will immediately say to you, no, these are all security issues. These are nothing to do with racializing someone. But they need to open their eyes and understand that they are part of a racist society.
Right. I mean, within Israel, do you have a very sort of divided society? I imagine that, and I see, groups like B'Tselem and so forth, that you have Israelis who do not subscribe to Zionism or in solidarity with Palestinians. Is there a lot of tension within Israel because of that today?
It's, to be honest, what one should say, there is a small subculture.
It's a
subculture in the sense of positive way, not in any hierarchical way.
Right.
There is a subculture or sub-alternative culture of Jews who this conversation between us would resonate with.
Okay.
Would understand the language that we are using, would not fall from the chair by the connections that we are making, the equation that we are proposing. But they are very small groups, so it's not a divided society because they do not constitute a significant electorate within the Jewish society.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important that they are there. No, I think the vast majority of the Jewish society possibly can be divided into two kinds of groups. People who really genuinely would not understand what we are talking about. Not because they are evil people or cynical people. They really would not understand what you're talking about. They have been misled for so many years, have been indoctrinated so successfully. They are living in bubbles that are protected by their own media and their own government, and a whole system of planting fears and intimidation in them that they could really not not join us in this discussion because it would be alien to them, if anything else, you know? It's like,
Right.
where are these people, two people coming from? What are they talking? They're not talking about Israel. They must be talking about another country. And there is a group, which is the most worrying one, I think, in many ways, which is very much located at the center, the strategic center of Israel, namely at the decision-making locations, whether in the army, the secret service, the government, the academia, the economy,
Right.
who know exactly what we are talking about, but feel that any admission of this would undermine their privileges and the privilege of their own society. And therefore, they believe that they have the power to maintain them. It's kind of a bizarre,
Yes.
cruel logic that was put to me. I once gave a lecture in the Weizmann Institute. The
Mhm.
Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel is the kind of MIT, it's more than even the MIT. It's kind of the most important scientific institution in Israel. A lot of Nobel Prize laureates teach there, and in chemistry, physics, and so on. So I gave them a lecture when I just started my way about what happened in '48. And I knew that these were very logical, knowledgeable people. And one of them stood up and he said, I believe you. I didn't know that. I didn't know about all these things. I'm too young. I wasn't there. Nobody in school told me about it. But you look like a decent person. I don't think you would have come all the way to Weizmann Institute to tell us a lie. So I summarize what you say. I accept it. We ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. We massacred thousands of them in order to create a state. Uh, because this is true, there's no other option but to continue and control them because they will never forgive
Yes.
us. We cannot, I mean, the whole notion of reconciliation, of acknowledgement, of kind of a closure
Right.
is totally alien to them.
Well,
So I think
yes.
that we have a problem here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
no, that's, I think, a really important point, Dr. Pape. I've always thought about that. Like, say, however far-fetched this is, that Israel does acknowledge what it's doing. Um, the amount of work that would be involved in reconciliation, in reparations, and dismantle, it is enormous. Um, and then there's also having to accept the reality that you were responsible for that. So I'm wondering whether you think that it's something that morally the state would never be able to live with if they
But
finally accepted that the NAPCA happened,
yeah,
that this was planned, and so forth.
yeah. I think luckily, I would like to put it in a historical context.
Sure.
Namely, I think that there were human situations like this before in modern history, and definitely, I suppose also in ancient history, but I'm not an expert on that. But in modern history, you had similar situations. Changes in perception, admission of moral guilt, moral
Yes.
accountability, willingness to give up privileges in order to let someone else live or live in dignity.
Yes.
Uh, Very rarely in history, Paul, these transformations occurred because the perpetrators themselves or the privileged society itself came to the conclusion that it
Yes.
was wrong. Very,
Right. Yes.
very rarely. The transformations usually happen with a strong pressure from the outside, unfortunately, defeat in the battlefield, you know. And then a small group of people within the privileged, the colonizer, the oppressor's society who were already doing the right or already going through that trajectory were
Right.
able to become much more important. It reminded me of my first visit to post-apartheid South Africa. Almost every white person I met told me that they were against apartheid.
Mm.
And it's like, if you were all against apartheid,
Right.
why did it last for so long, you know?
Yes. Right.
And then I realized they were retelling their own story according to the new situation. So
Ah.
I think you don't need a total transformation, but I agree, it's a huge hurdle. My frustration, by the way, at this moment in time, is less about the height of the mountain that has to be climbed in order to get there. I mean, that by itself can
Right.
can really take the wind out of your sails. But I'm frustrated that we are not. There are certain preliminary things that have to be done in order to face properly this climb into a different future. For example, a clearer unity on the Palestinian side, a clearer vision of the future on the Palestinian side, a clear definition by the Palestinians themselves. How do they see the liberation project of Palestine in the 21st
Yes.
century? How do they see the role of the Jews who live now in Israel in that future? It's very difficult to get it nowadays for obvious objective reasons of fragmentation caused by oppression and destruction, but nonetheless, it's missing. Uh, we need at least some members of the political elites in the West to stop being intimidated or bribed and join us at least as some braver politicians began to do only in their when they were in their 80s, you know, like
Yes.
Bernie Sanders and
Right.
Jeremy Corbyn. But we need the civil society to have more impact on political elites, and then face a very long journey, but a possible journey that would include sanctions, boycott, pressure, united popular struggle on the ground. Unfortunately, I can't see as kind of, a very comfortable
Right.
journey out of the comfort zone of the Jews in Israel. I can't see
Sure.
them doing it in a way, although I never give up on my interaction with the Israeli Jewish society. I do all I can, and not alone, all I can to talk, to dialogue, to educate, but I'm not eluding myself
Right.
that this kind of project will be the major factor in bringing a change and a very needed change on the ground.
Right. Oh, yes. And I know, Dr. Pappe, you've mentioned somewhere, I can't remember exactly, something to the effect that the facts of the cleansing, they're indisputable, right? Um, the UN has recognized the legality of the occupation and so forth. Canada's own foreign policy has done the same. So the world recognizes what's happening, but there's been no accountability. There's been no prosecution. Why is that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good. It's a very good question, and I think it differs a bit from one international actor to the other. So I
Right.
think the case of Canada may be more similar to the case of America, but the case of Europe might be a bit different in the case of Canada. It's a mixture of certain groups within the political elites of Western states that have no interest in defying Israel's demand that this particular ethnic cleansing will not recognize and not acknowledge as such.
Yeah.
It differs. For instance, in the case of Western Europe, I still think that the guilt of the Holocaust plays an important role there, not just because of what the Nazis did, but the fact that so many Western European communities collaborated with the Nazis and enabled the genocide of the Jews. And there's no closure yet for that chapter because of Zionism. They never really dealt with this properly. That might change a bit with the generations, because it's certain generations it still feels complex. I think there is another issue of buying Israel, the idea of Israel of being part of the Judeo-Christian
Mm.
heritage civilization theories like Samuel Huntington's theories of
Yes.
a clash of civilization. Israel is on our side. There is the American notions that Israel serves its strategic and
Yes.
national interest, and different groups within America have their own reasons for accepting unconditionally Israel and its policies. I think it also has to do with the fact that the West, and this includes Australia and New Zealand as well,
Right.
the West has not yet probably dealt with its own ethnic cleansing
Ah, yes. Good
operations
point.
and brutality. And I
Very good
think
point.
if you don't deal and you still think that you belong to a community of nations, which is the civilized community compared to the rest of the world, whatever happens in Israel might reflect what should happen in your own place, I
Oh,
think.
certainly.
I'm
Yes.
not surprised that the only proper support for Israel in the House of Representatives in the United States comes from three women who represent minorities in America. It's not surprising.
Yes.
And I think this is something to look at. But it's a mixture of strategic interest, in imperialist interest, capitalist interest, of course. I mean,
Right.
Israeli security industry is and high tech industry is so well connected to what Noam Chomsky used to call the corporatocracy.
Yes.
The corporations who run our lives, the international corporations who run our lives. They're very important to them. They are part of them. So in this, I think that's the reason. And I would add, just to finish the answer here,
Yes.
the new nations of Europe, those who were liberated from the Soviet control, they have a particularly dismal history when it comes to the Jews during the Holocaust.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of the reasons that they are even more embarrassingly pro-Israeli than the rest of the Western world. But as you can see, Paul,
Yes.
Arab regimes are willing to legitimize Israel. Uh, China has no problem with
Yes.
Israel. India doesn't have any problem. Israel is now pressuring Indonesia and Pakistan to go in the
Right.
same direction. I don't know if they will succeed, but they're trying to do that. The African member states who signed the 75 resolution are now standing in the queue to establish normal relations with Israel. So, political elites are not particularly known for moral
Right.
consideration or caring for human rights and civil rights if the violation of these rights serves their national interests, despite of the
Uh,
discourse that they might use, even
oh,
academia.
oh, certainly. That's why it's a point very well taken because, for a long time I've been thinking, which one is it more? Is it religion or is it political economy that we should be focusing on when we're talking about Israel and
Right.
foreign relations? Um, I know you don't. I'm very conscious of your time and grateful for Dr. Pappe. So I'll maybe just ask maybe one more question. I mean, of course, I think this is on a lot of people's minds. Um, sort of the way forward, for Palestine. Um,
Yeah, definitely.
yes.
Um, there are really two options. One which is propagated by the political elites of the world, most of the member states of the United Nations, by the Palestinian Authority, by the liberal Zionists and the American administration. This is the idea of a two-state solution,
Hmm.
namely a Palestinian state, a very reduced state
Right.
without full sovereignty, without army, without control on its own foreign and economic policy, and located in a very small part of historical Palestine and under constant Israeli monitoring and control, what we used to call Bantustan
Mm.
in
Hmm.
in South Africa. This used to be the hegemonic solution, kind of the accepted solution. I think it's dead for many years. It's not only not a solution that would have solved the problem.
Right.
Nowadays it's also unrealistic because of the Jewish presence in the West Bank. It's not going to work anyway. So I think that solution, although we will hear a lot people still supporting it, I don't think it has any chance.
Right.
The only way forward is really to build a democratic state, a state for all the citizens, Jews and Arabs, without any discrimination
Yes.
on the basis of religion, race, gender, ethnicity, on historical Palestine. It is in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. You need to build a democratic state there. You have to rectify some of the evils of the past, which means you have to, at least in principle, accept the Palestinian refugees' right of return.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a closure you need to have. Without that right, without that acceptance that these people have the right to repatriate, you don't undermine the racist nature of the system that we talked about. And there are other colonialist institutions that have to be dismantled in order to make it a more equitable society. And this will just begin a process which will trouble of facing issues that trouble the Arab world as a whole, and maybe the whole world. The whole question of how do people with different perspectives on morality live next to each
Right.
other? How do religious people share a space with secular people? How people who want to keep a collective identity of a sect, of their society, of their culture, uh, how how much can they do this within this democratic system? A lot of work. I don't think
Yes.
there are easy solutions, but I always say we wasted 50 years and more on looking for a way to implement the wrong solution. It's a
Mm.
waste of time and energy, and we should look we should invest our time in the right solution, despite the fact that so many difficulties connected to it. There's no option. The only option is the other option is the continued reality of
Yes.
apartheid, oppression, occupation, killings, strangulating the Gaza ghetto. Uh, Israel can maintain it for a very long time, but if you don't accept that, you need to accept the other option. That there is another way in which Jews and Arabs can live in this land. By the way they lived before 1948.
You're right.
Yeah,
Right.
there is a history of living together as Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Palestine. It was
Yes.
not always like that. Zionism, in many ways, by turning Judaism into political issue, uh, disrupted a certain way of living and of live and let live. That, of course, had its own problems because of the historical time it was in. But
Yes.
in principle, it had the right ingredients for envisaging a different kind of.
Surely. Having a philosophical background, I just wanted to leave people with this very powerful passage from The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, your book, of course, um, because I think, it speaks to the pressing nature of why something needs to be done, right? That honors the rights and dignity um, and autonomy of Palestinians. And you write here, and again, it's a very philosophical passage which caught my attention. What the Palestinians are demanding, and what for many of them has become a sine qua non, is that they be recognized as the victims of an ongoing evil, consciously perpetrated against them by Israel. For Israeli Jews to accept this would naturally mean undermining their own status of victimhood. This would also have political implications on an international scale, but also, perhaps far more critically, would trigger moral and existential repercussions for the Israeli Jewish psyche. Israeli Jews would have to recognize that they would have to become the mere image of their own worst nightmare. Um, So I think, yeah, maybe actually that, let me just rephrase what I was saying before. I think that kind of is the difficulty I was speaking to before, because that seems to be like a big barrier, right? Like, what's going to happen, do you think, like once there is this acceptance, once there is this recognition, as you say, um,
Mhm.
on moral and existential grounds, what will happen? It is a big thing to kind of
Yeah.
recognize yourself as a perpetrator, if I can use that word. And but is there a way of kind of doing that while ushering peace?
I think there is, and I
Yeah,
think that we have to. I mean, this, as you're right, this is a philosophical kind of brooding. When
right,
you plate it into a political program, you have to take into account you're talking about an incremental process, one that is not happening in one day. It's not that people are asked to do it in one go and so on, and
right,
kind of absorb the trauma of, of that. So I think it needs preparation, it needs thinking of how to convey this to people without degrading them,
right.
without turning them into criminals. I fully agree. My frustration at the time when I wrote this back in 2006 was that none of the people who were involved in the so-called peace processes,
Mm,
um, Arab Jewish dialogue groups, none of them realized that this is the main issue. So they didn't invest any thought and energy of how to do it in a way that does not create a sense of existential fear. Having said that, one thing I think should be clear uh, to Israeli Jews. This is not the problem of the Palestinians. It
mm,
is so difficult for Israelis to understand it.
mhm, mhm.
I experienced a a strong dialogue between a Palestinian actress that was part of a play that was shown in Jaffa in Israel. And there was a dialogue with the audience.
Mm,
And the play dealt with all the issues we were talking about. And a guy got up and he said, but I'm so fearful of what you do to us
mm.
once you liberate. And she looked at him and she said, I sympathize with you. I understand this, but this is not my problem.
Oh, okay.
This
Yes,
is your problem. And I think, and I will finish here by
yes,
something that the great philosopher said to me.
yes.
Yeshayahu Leibovich, who was really one of the greatest philosophers in Israel. I came to him, I was a student of his, and I told him that because my um, family comes from Germany,
Yes.
I want to do a PhD on the Holocaust,
Okay.
on the Germans. I want to understand what happened to the German society. And he looked at me and he said, why? This is the problem of the Germans. Let them deal with it. They have to deal with it. You have to deal with what your society did. He
Okay.
said, if you tell me, because I told him, I don't want to write just a PhD. I want to write a PhD which matters morally and philosophically, etc. He said,
Right.
if this is the case, don't write about the Germans. Write about your own society. They would need this kind of discussion. The Germans need to do their own. They don't need you. The Germans don't need you to tell them what is guilt and how you deal with guilt and how you transform. Your society needs to know what is guilt, what are they guilty of, and how they're going to deal with this. Now, I'm
Yes.
not saying that because he said this, I have the solution or a good answer to your question. I'm just saying that this is where the effort should be. We don't have time to elaborate it, but I
Yes.
think you understand that fear is manipulated. It's not just authentic, it's also manipulated. Once you understand that there are certain things that the Israeli Jewish society are totally ignorant because of their races, namely the basic impulses among the Palestinians, which have nothing to do with revenge and retribution. And
Yes.
so there's so much unlearning to be done as part of a huge effort that I think, alongside the other processes we talked about, are humanly possible. Very difficult, but possible and worth the effort, no doubt.
Okay, no, that's so well put, Dr. Pape. Thank you so much. Um, I have so many more questions, but of course, I'm mindful of your time, and I'm just so grateful and honored by this this rare opportunity to speak with you. Thankfully, now we have the recording, so
Fantastic.
it will go up. Yeah, and I'll stay in touch with you very shortly as to like
Please do.
the
Please do.
links and everything. And I feel this was a wonderful discussion. Really,
Excellent.
thank you
It was
so
great
much.
to
And
continue. Thank
yeah,
you very much.
yes, of course, and continue the wonderful work that you're
Excellent.
doing.
Thank you
Okay,
very much. We
okay,
will do. Thank
okay.
you.
Take care. Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.